Juli, welcome back to a new episode of the Mashtia Collective podcast.
Hello.
We are here for the second time because I already started recording and had technical
difficulties.
Yes.
So we're just gonna get straight to the point. We're escaping this world today.
Yes, because in the midst of all the daily troubles, a good dose of escapism is always great. And nobody does it better than Sarah J Maas, who we'll be talking about today. In case you don't know and have been living under a rock, Sarah J Maas is a huge literary phenomenon today. Mm-hmm. She is the author, I guess I'll kind of go into it. She's the author of, at this point, more than 8 plus 7, 15 novels, fantasy novels.
Hold on. How many Throne of Glass books are there? 7?
7, I think. 7 or 8.
Okay, I'm never gonna read that. That's way too many books. That's way too many.
And they're long.
Plus the 5 Aquatar, plus the 3 Crescent City.
Yes. No, I think you should still read Crescent City, but we'll get into that.
No, I'm reading
shortly.
Crescent City. I'm reading, but
Okay.
Throne of Glass. This is such a commitment.
It's a big commitment. Getting into the Sarah J Maas universe is a big commitment. And we'll get to that in a second. So yeah, Sarah J Maas is basically this American author of multiple fantasy novels. At the beginning, her books, I believe, were more categorized as teen books, but now they've moved on to become young adult fantasy books because they deal with more kind of explicit and heavier topics. Mm-hmm. Her first series, so she's written 3 sets of series up to this point. The first one was the Throne of Glass series, which is the one that I was just saying has 7 or 8 books. It's a total of more than 5,000 pages in total. Then the second one was A Court of Thorns and Roses. And the third one, most recent one, is the Crescent City series. They all happen in different lands, obviously, because it's fantasy. It's completely different universes. That's why we were saying that they're the best escapism, because you truly, once you flip the page open, you're just immediately immersed in a completely different reality.
For now.
Different lands for now.
I was watching to prepare for this episode. I was watching this video this girl made on YouTube. I found it, and she was the deep dive into Sarah J Maas, and I was like, it didn't have any spoiler warnings anywhere. She wasn't spoilers. So I was like, okay, cool. I'm gonna watch this video because it's a deep dive into the author, which is what I thought. Okay. And inevitably, I knew that she. Yeah, she spoiled the end of Crescent City, so now I have to read it.
No, that's the worst. That's the worst because I feel similar to Colleen Hoover, who we talked about in our first episode, actually, if you want to go check it out, although it's in Spanish. One of the things that Sarah J Maas does really well is the factor, the surprise, the twist and whatnot, things that you expect. So that's really bad that you got spoiled. But I'm sure when you read it, there will still be enough moments for you, because she does a few. Yeah.
And I tend to just quickly, little notes. I tend to love reading the end, the last chapter before reading the book, because I can't cope with the anxiety that not knowing what's gonna happen gives me. Yeah, I've been trying to be really good at not doing that with Aquatar or with and once you get into, it's like Colleen Hoover, once you get into the rhythm of Sarah J Maas, you kind of see where she's going, there is this one moment, and I don't know if you remember it or not, but I texted you at the beginning when I started reading Aquatar. I was like, this dude is gonna show up at the end and save the day, right? And you were like, keep reading, and then I was like, he showed up at the end and saved the day. I knew it, but it's you can kind of see the kind of, she's not super formulaic like Colleen Hoover is, but she still has some shock factors that are coming.
Yes, she has a style for sure. It's very distinguishable. But Juli, what was your introduction to Sarah J Maas?
Well, we talked last week a little bit about when we worked at the bookstore together, and I remember this was 2017. And that was when A Court of Thorns and Roses was just being written. I think Aquatar and Aquamath, A Court of Mist and Fury, you gotta forgive me starting to say these books. ESL, there's so many words in these titles, and it's so hard to pronounce in a way that makes actual sense for me. So I'll just stick to the abbreviated version. Yeah. But yeah, I remember those were huge, and when we worked there, I remember getting moms and daughters and people in general looking for those books.
Yeah.
I remember seeing the Throne of Glass kind of series that was like the books that were already published. I remember also were very big in that time. But I've never really been into fantasy until very recently. Mm-hmm. So I was never really like interested in reading them. Mm-hmm. So then fast forward like many years, and to now, so like right now, because I'm currently reading A Court of Silver Flames, and I read earlier in the year, so in January, I read the 2 Empyrean books, Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, and they got me into fantasy like so hard. I was like, I need more like this. And after like many years of you pleading me to read these books, I was like, you know what? I'm gonna give it a try. Like worst case, I can't get into it. So actually, no, I started ACOTAR before trying the Empyrean books because of your pleading. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I can't get into it. Like the first like 10 chapters, I'm like, this could have been an email so hard. Like, I'm like, come on, girl, move it along. But then once it starts, like the Under the Mountain, like that, the third act of that book is so flipping good. Like just at the end. Yes. But you have to get through so much like Tamlin BS to be able to get to the good part of like Under the Mountain. Anyways, so yeah, like I tried it, then I didn't like it, then I read Empyrean, and then I was like, I was like so book hungover, so I needed to give it a try, and then I did, and now I'm into the 5th book, and I'm almost there. I'm like, I have like 10% left. So yeah, and that's kind of how I came across her. How about you? Because you brought me Sarah J Maas.
Yes. So very similar to you, I remember having seen her while we worked at the bookstore, because I usually worked the kids and teen section. And when there were downtimes, basically all I did was like flip through books,
I caught you reading like 4 times. Yeah. Just like standing there.
Yeah. And like writing titles down on like my to read list and whatnot, which was like ever growing. I don't think I've even gotten to all those books yet. But yes, those are definitely there. But at the time they had kind of ugly covers. And you know how they always say don't judge a book by its cover. But honestly, the cover plays a huge part in you picking up a book. So I never picked them up, but I did pick up another series called The Selection, which is like more dystopian, but very similar in the sense of like, oh, there's, male and female lead or whatever, and they fall in love, they face some horrible hardship, and then they overcome it. Mm-hmm. And even though it's not fantasy per se, I don't think, but it's still not set in like our present day and age, like we're still some sort of like, oh, this is a bit of a different world or universe, different kind of society. And so after I read The Selection, some time passed, and one day just randomly, I was like, oh, I'm kind of craving reading something like this again. And so I just Googled essentially like books similar to The Selection, and A Court of Thorns and Roses came up. And I remember like the name started ringing a bell, in the movie Inside Out. Where the little guys in the brain, are like sifting through the archives. I was like, oh, right. Like that existed somewhere in my brain. Like that name and those books ring a bell because ACOTAR, so that's the abbreviated form of A Court of Thorns and Roses. And then even though every book has its own name, it's just called the ACOTAR series. Those were released, I think, 2015. So if I'm not mistaken, only 1 or 2 of those were out at that point. But
I think ACOTAR and Aquamath.
Yes, but her first series, Throne of Glass, already had some more out by that point. So she had definitely already started building a fan base, building a name for herself. And so I started reading ACOTAR, and I was on my way out somewhere, and I had downloaded the sample on my Kindle because that's usually kind of what I do when I want to start a new book before committing to like, buying it, especially when it's series, because I know that if I get hooked, then I'm in this like time and financial commitment for long. So I was like, let me see this first. And honestly, I was hooked, which was very different from your experience that you just shared because you were like, oh, the first like 10 chapters could have been an email. Whereas for me, I was hooked from page 1 because like just the characters seemed very intriguing to me. The situation that she found herself in was like, why is this little girl doing this?
I remember when I started reading it, like for like a month, you kept asking me where I was, and I'm like, she's hunting. a month later, she's still hunting, and you were like, how is she still hunting? And you've been reading this for a month, and if you read the book, you know why this is ridiculous.
If you know, you know. But and I was hooked immediately, and basically from then on, there's 2 months of my life during which I read these books where I cannot remember what happened in real life. I'm like,
or in the books,
or in the so I read them towards like in the winter of 2022. And I remember this distinctly because that Christmas I actually didn't go home or had my family visit. Like I just stayed here. And I remember, and at my workplace, we have a couple of days between Christmas and New Year's that we have off. I did nothing else. Like I did. And there was like this massive snowstorm in Vancouver. Like no one was really like going out or anything. And I remember those days were like glorious to me because I was like, it was like 3 or 4 days that I just spent at home. You know, that period between Christmas and New Year's, there's not a lot to do anyway.
Nobody knows
it's
what
just
day
like
it is.
It's just like a little bit like a meh time. It was like snowing outside, and the books themselves are so great for a winter setting, especially the latter ones. And I was just like, oh my God, like I was in reading heaven. And I got so into them. Like, honestly, I was barely eating and showering. Like those was about as much as I could do because every single day I was consumed with these books. And yes, after that, obviously I was like super book hungover, like similar to you. So I was like, no, I need more of this. And so I committed to the Throne of Glass series, which left me a little bit less satisfied than ACOTAR did. And then after taking a few months, because my brain was just hurting after Throne of Glass, I was reading some other things. Eventually, I did go back to read her books and read Crescent City. So at the time of recording, I have read all of her books except one, which is one of the Throne of Glass series, which is a set of short stories that give a little bit of one of the characters' backstories. I didn't end up reading that. But I've read online that it's actually really good. So I might go back to read that one. But essentially, yes, I have read most books in the Sarah J Maas universe, as they were calling it now, in the Maasverse, as they're calling it. But honestly, if you talk to me, it would seem like I haven't, because I don't remember most of it.
and the funny thing is, I like, again, pleading me to read the books. Remember reading the books, and then I'm like, yo, this is happening. I'm losing my mind. And she's like, when does this happen? I'm like, can't believe it's like a major plot point. It's a major plot point. And you're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, come on, like the whole book
I know.
This premise. So
I know. I
read them again. Shout out to the Fantasy Fangirls podcast.
Yes.
For doing a deep dive that you could probably go and listen to chapter by chapter.
You know what? In all honesty, and this is a little bit of a side note, but related to this, I feel like I just need to probably take some supplement for my gray matter or something, because I'm like, I will obsess over something and like, just devote so much time and energy, and then a few months go by and it's out of my mind completely. But I'm like the same with shows or
so I very recently read Harry Potter, and as a confession, because I was never into them when I was a child, and then recently I read them, and I understand that I have kept all of that in my brain because I'm an adult, and if I would have read it as a child, probably a lot of those things would have escaped me. So whenever I share, like I talked about Harry Potter things with you, for example, the whole like trope in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire with Hermione and like opening SPW and trying to like bring welfare to the elves, like all that whole plot you don't remember, like it's just gone. So like for me it's like, okay, whatever. She read it as a kid, fine. I'm not gonna dig into you for like, because that's a major plot point. That's why like Dobby's death at the end is so like, anyways. But you remember Dobby dies at least. But
and you know what? I watch the movies every year. That's like my fall tradition to watch. And I know not every detail's in the movies, but still there are a lot of things that I'm like, huh?
But then okay, fast forward now. It's like, okay, you read the books like a year and a half ago, fine. And then I'm gonna share these things. I'm like, I'm losing my mind. And you're like, I don't remember. I'm like, come on.
Yeah. Anyways. But anyway, so but Juli, why has the world gone crazy with Sarah J Maas? Like, why are we all reading all her books? Why are people labeling the Maasverse? Like, what's happening? What's the phenomenon behind her?
I think we get like these like cycles. They're not quite cycles, but kind of cycles with authors, particularly female authors. I've noticed like once every few years, and you got like J.K. Rowling and like Harry Potter and the detailed intricacies of like her world and how it took the world by storm, and how the wizarding world is even like a brand, and you can go to Universal and like escape there and like all these things. And the books are, people follow them, and there's trivia and all these things. And then you have like Stephanie Meyer later with Twilight and the movies, and people reading the books and people obsessing over it. Maybe not as much as Harry Potter, obviously, because it's a different level of like depth. And then now I feel like, and then you get Colleen Hoover too, which was like dealing with like very difficult topics, and kind of Colleen Hoover, I guess it's a bit different because you're not necessarily escaping reality. You're reading books that like highlight reality in a way, and highlight the ugly things about reality, and are relatable for people that are going through awful experiences and like see their experiences like planted in paper.
Yeah.
And then now you have Sarah J Maas, who's like, I feel like another iteration of the same concept of waves, where she was in the right place at the right time and wrote books that took the world by storm because of how like genre bending they are. They're like fantasy, but they're romance. They are young adults, but they deal with like a lot of explicit things such as like sex and murder and violence and all those things that are very explicit, that are not your typical like young adult. Like Stephanie Meyer was not writing like this. Even in like Breaking Dawn, she wasn't writing like this.
Yeah.
Like you can see how writing has evolved with her too. And I think also like she has a lot of appeal from a lot of different like groups of people. The people you have the people that like love fantasy, love dragons, will read Aragon and will read all those books and are very into fantasy, world building, escaping. And you have me, who I love romance and politics. Like if you have romance and politics in a book, I'm probably gonna read it. So then you have again all of these genres kind of like coming into one place. Plus also you have book talk too. Yeah, which we talked about at our Colleen Hoover episode. Again, it's in Spanish. If you want to listen to it, go back. And if you can understand it, great. If not, there's subtitles on YouTube. Yes. But she like kind of, I think BookTok has helped like with the marketing, and sales and things like that. And you even have like people in BookTok doing Aquatar inspired workout routines, like kind of following Nesta's workout and Silver Flames. You have people doing Aquatar inspired like playlists with music. And you have all these things that kind of just like bring you back to the world. And the funny, or I guess impressive thing is there hasn't been any movie adaptation of any of her books yet.
There will be a
TV show adaptation. Yes, but this is so huge already. Like I feel like a lot of these other books, like Harry Potter was already huge before the movies. Obviously it was, but the movies brought it to a whole nother level. Yeah, because people could see with their eyes what you could imagine when you're reading the book. Whereas this is like people are already building words in their head, or like I kept googling like Risan's wings, could kind of understand how this works, or like Valaris, because I had to understand how the city that I'm imagining and the city that the people are imagining, if we all imagine the same thing, and people are already investing time and energy into making these things happen, so like I think it's kind of about all of these different things, like the right place, the right time, and genre bending. So what do you think?
I think that definitely those are huge reasons, or like huge factors that go together into making this a phenomenon, and to like why her books as opposed to other ones, right? I think at a deeper level though, like these waves tell us something a little bit about, and it's not new. It has always existed, but the internet has just given this a new dimension, and is the actual people seeking for a community. And I think that's seeking for belonging, and that's seeking for like, oh, there's others in the world, who are enjoying the same things I enjoy. As I said, like this is not new. We've seen it in music basically since the inception of music, or like you know what I mean, like. But I think that the internet, as with many other sorts of like subcultures, I guess if you could call it that, the internet has just like given this place where you're like, oh, I don't even have to know these people to know that I'll connect, like we can all rally behind it. So it creates that desire to even express your own creativity out of someone else's, right? Like she obviously was exercising her vivid imagination and like her writing skills and all of this by writing these books. But then you've got people who also know how to draw. And so they're creating a lot of fan art. And as you say, it's a resource for those of us who belong to the community to be like, oh, are people imagining this character like I'm imagining it too? Or like, how did people, you know, envision so-and-so character? Like, I remember one of the characters that I searched up fan art of was the Surreal, because I couldn't quite see it in my mind, like how the Surreal looked. And I was like, oh, yeah, you know what I mean? And then it's also just interesting to see how people see certain characters differently than you. Like there's a character in Crescent City who is described as having short hair. So this was honestly the artist's flaw, but they described her with long hair, but they drew her with long hair, I mean. And I was like looking at her and I'm like, one, you missed the point, she has short hair. Yeah. but two, I was like, oh, interesting that when you were drawing this, you kind of took that artistic liberty as well. And then in your mind, you saw her that way, right? So I don't know. So I feel like, and then some people who have written fan fictions about it, people who have written like theories about it, people who have made videos about it, people who have made podcasts out of it, like the fantasy fangirls that you were mentioning. So I just find it so interesting how that deeper desire for community, to connect, to have this thing in common. I think it's definitely one of the driving forces behind this, you know, the popularity. But then if you add in the factors that you said, it's like, then it's like, why her books as opposed to others, right? But I think that underlying desire. And then I think that second one that I would say is like the underlying desire to escape reality a little bit probably has placed some sort of factor into it. I'm not a psychologist, but I would bet good money. No, actually I wouldn't. I don't need to spend more money, but I would. I think it has legs, like the theory to say that the reason why in our day and age, like presently, where we're like bombarded all the time with so many bad news, where we see like conflict raging in the world, where we're all kind of, you know, hard pressed on every side with like economic uncertainty and all that. It's like you can immerse yourself in this world, you know, like in this basically alternate reality, you know, in a very escapist way, obviously. Because as you were saying, like Colleen Hoover, it's like, it's more kind of stories that you could potentially see in your actual like day-to-day life, obviously written and told in a very dramatic way that will make you like, you know, flush and cry and get enraged. But it's still very much based in the world that we know and that we live in. Whereas I think that we're at a crux in time where people would probably want to just like truly disconnect. And I think that has helped the fantasy genre in and of itself explode.
Yeah. It's interesting though that what you're saying that, because I agree with you that like people want to escape and people read fantasy to kind of leave this world in a way. But then it's not like you're going to a world that has no issues and everything is fairy dust and, you know, pixie dust. It's like, you're going to war, you're going to like different politics, and you're going to like couple drama and, you know, relationship drama and people not communicating. Please say what you want, you know, please. I know that if you say what you want, this book will be so short, but like just say what you want. And it kind of like reinforces. It goes back to the point, like, does art imitate life or does life imitate art? Like if it's a book written from lived experiences transplanted to a different world, then of course we're gonna have people being dramatic and people not being able to communicate, because in this world people don't know how to communicate. People are dramatic, people, all these things, and so it's just you just drop that in Velaris or you drop that in Prithian, but it's still like issues that we deal with today. So I guess you kind of swap your problems for like Fairy's problems or Feyre's problems, and then with you like, okay, I'm just gonna be in Feyre's head for a second, and I don't have to think about my own problems. But it's not like it doesn't give me like relief. Like I'm just gonna go read like a very, because you don't read for that. You read to find connection, not just with others, but also with the author and with the character you're reading. You know, even if it's books like recently another book you've been putting me to read is the Addie LaRue.
Yes, the Invisible Life of Addie LaRue.
Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. And like,
Love
it's a
that
book, great book. I'm like halfway through. A lot of her experiences I won't share because of the premise of the book, you know? But you still find some sort of understanding in certain things that you can see. This is very frustrating for the character, and it is very frustrating for many women in the world, you know, like dating, for example, you know, and like you have that shared understanding. Same with this book. Another thing you said that I found very interesting is that when I was doing some research for this episode, is that the New York Times and other publishers said that Sarah J Maas, particularly the ACOTAR series, but also with the other books, created what the publishers actually call the Harry Potter effect, where reading a book became a shared experience. Because before Harry Potter, people would read books, but like it was like, oh, I read a book in my house. But because Harry Potter was coming out at a you know, the dawn of the internet, kind of like late 90s, early 2000s, people were like super connected and starting to connect more. And you had lots of kids reading at the same time in schools. And I remember seeing my friends, because I wasn't into them, but my friends would bring Order of the Phoenix and sit down and like, you know, start reading. You probably did that too in school.
Yeah.
And
100%,
like, 100%. So like you kind of have the same effect, but now, as you were saying, the internet just like amplifies that, you know. It's like you're part of this ginormous book club, you know, that I listen to the Fantasy Fangirls podcast, and I'm like, man, I had that same thought. Oh, I hadn't even looked at it at that way, you know. It's the same thing that you probably did when you were a child reading Order of the Phoenix with your friends and exchanging opinions and be like, oh, what chapter are you on, and kind of like, oh, reading quickly so you can catch up, so you can, you know, talk about those things. So it's what these books have created, and the internet has made it bigger. And when you were talking about like why her books and not other people's books, I think she's been a genius, and it's something that Colleen Hoover, Rebecca Yarros, and Sarah J Maas share, which is why probably they're three of them are so big. They're geniuses in Taylor Swifting the game, you know, capitalizing on that, and like giving out Easter eggs, or like selling different versions of the book, where in each book you have like this is something I read that apparently Sarah J Maas does. I don't know because I acquire my books, but that you say different versions of the book, where each book has for example, like if you buy the special version number 1, you have an extra chapter that only that book has. So you need to buy all of the different special versions, so you get all the extra chapters for those books and stuff like that, which is something Taylor Swift does all the time. She sells 7 different vinyls with 7 different extra songs that you can only get if you buy all the vinyls.
Right.
And they like keep dropping Easter eggs here and there, or like they'll drop an Easter egg for Crescent City on this book, or the other way around. So you crave reading it, and you crave other people talking about it too. So you can see if you understood things correctly. Like that's how Taylor Swift does it too. And they're just marketing geniuses, because they know that there's so much conversation going on about it. Let's just spark more, and the more people talk about it, the more like Rebecca Yarros, for example, came out in an interview recently saying that if you haven't read the Imperium books, whatever, but like saying that there's a big plot point that is going to happen in the next book that has already been hinted in the second book. And so everybody went back to read it, because it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I missed this. And so similar thing, Sarah J Maas has done the same thing, where like she comes out in interviews and says, like, drops a bomb, but then goes out and pieces out. And then everybody sparks conversation again. So the cycle starts back up, and so new people come back and read them and all these things. So I think they're just very genius in continuing to spark conversation. I mean, I don't think it's like intentionally I want to sell more, but it's like, oh, people are talking about it, I'm just gonna give more to talk about, you know.
Yes. And I think, you know, that's a very interesting point, because like a couple months ago, Sarah J Maas signed with Bloomsbury, who's now their like her publishing house, I guess. Because initially, if I'm not mistaken, very similarly to Colleen Hoover, she was like self-published, or like self-published, and like utilized online forums to publish her works and whatnot. Started rallying a little bit of a community there, and eventually got picked up by Bloomsbury. But now she has signed for 11 more books. And that's... Well,
11.
I guess 10 now, because she's released Crescent City 3. But in my mind, this is the part where I'm like, I sometimes feel that although I'm all for, you know, authors getting the recognition they deserve, I think out of all the different types of creative work that you can publish, writing is one of those that a few years back, and I don't know if you remember this, like everyone was talking about the potential end of the publishing industry. Like everyone was talking about how no one was reading, and how like yeah, just like the reading as a habit had gone completely down. No one was picking books. Bookstores were closing left and right and all of this. And so I think that all these phenomenon have actually really helped to invigorate a potentially dying industry, or at least dying in the way that we were used to knowing it. Because I feel like people will always write, there will always be people who read, but it was kind of like shifting, right? And so, but there's another point, and we kind of touched on it when we talked about Colleen Hoover. Like, I'm definitely not out here being like, you know, sitting in a high chair and like smoking a long cigar and being like, oh, the noble art of pure literature is dead, because I feel like whatever gets people reading is great. Especially now that we're also like, you know, facing just like this crisis of attention and crisis of like, you know, so much screen time and whatnot. Like anything that gets you off that and exercising a little bit of your own creative brain and imagination, like reading is hailed as a great habit for a reason, and it's backed by science and it's backed by, you know, experience and all of that. So like, I think anything that gets people reading is great. But on the other hand, I'm just like, okay, but also how much are we willing to compromise? And I'm struggling to say quality, but I'm just going to say it because I can't find another word. Just because it's become so commercially successful that we just want to keep churning them out, you know, like it because like her initial book, like Thrones of Glass, regardless of my personal opinion on it, I think it's like an amazing book. Like the way she was able to carry certain themes and develop so many characters throughout 7 books, like that's a great feat. You know what I mean? And not everyone can do it. It's like one of the reasons.
At 16.
And she started at 16. Like that's one of the reasons why J.K. Rowling is like huge as well, right? And like the way that she created this like whole universe that existed just like in this one person's brain. You know what I mean? Like that's insane. And you created whole family histories and family lines and a political system, you know, in a land and all of this, like out of your own imagination. But now you've got a contract to fulfill to publish 10 more books. And so it's like, are you going to come up with a new series, or are you going to continue to stretch the existing ones until they're like dying end? And the only reason why I say this is because personally, I've read Crescent City 3 now, like the newest installment that just came out. And honestly, I was a little bit let down. I'm going to say it publicly. Like, I don't think it was a bad book, but I think that it wasn't ACOTAR level. You know what I mean? When she was probably more writing, probably she had a contract or whatnot, but it was very likely that she was not under the pressure that she's under now. So I'm like, you know, like when you hit that commercial success, it's like, ooh, for the creators, like how can they ensure that they keep, you know, that exercise of their imagination and that and the way they've been working, and the reason why so many people have come to love her when now you have, you know, a set amount of books to fulfill, and you've got to stretch your stories to fill that quota, you know?
Yeah, and that's something I felt. I mean, I haven't finished Silver Flames yet. I have like 20% left. But it's something I felt while reading Crescent. A Court of Silver Flames. I felt that because I told you this. I felt like the story ended with Aquawar. Possibly the one you like, the novella. Like it just adds a little. Frost and Starlight. It has a little bit of prettiness and like, oh, we're all a happy family now. But I feel like this whole development in this book, especially the beginning of the book, was kind of like just pulled out of thin air because she had she had a deadline to fulfill, and she had, you know, and I don't know if she had already signed the books. I'm happy, and I know that she has come out publicly to say like she has a really big connection with Nesta, that like she really feels a lot of the PTSD that Nesta went through. She's something that she like shares through her experiences. I'm not saying that she just like trying to continue to write stories, because I understand that she wants to develop Nesta further. And again, I haven't finished the book, so I still don't know where this book ends. Like I kind of haven't. I can imagine, but I don't know where this book ends. But I also feel like, you know, that it was done. You know, like this story was done. So now you're like your characters that you developed, especially with the different narration styles, because I've been spending 3 books in Farah's head. And so I think like Farah thinks. And so if I'm reading a story from the same vein or like the same world, in my mind, I'm gonna think like Farah because that's who you introduced to me first. So for me as a reader, having to shift my head and just being like not, and it's not even like I'm thinking like Nessa now. It's just this omniscient reader who feels everything and is there all the time. I mean, narrator, sorry, who's there all the time. Who like now I'm like I don't know who to like. I don't understand how to read this book in a way that like makes me feel like I felt with the first three books because I was like in Farah's point of view. So I feel like I see what you're saying. I agree, and I think I was also reading that a lot. I don't her books. I've been listening to them on audiobook because I like get caught up in the story and I want to keep reading while I'm working, and the way to do that is by like Audible, you know. So like I listen to them. So I don't pay attention to like grammar or punctuation or whatnot because I'm not reading them. But apparently, I don't know if you can confirm or deny, her last few books have been like edited a bit more sloppily. Like she'll miss commas, or she'll like add too many commas, or she'll completely like ignore, like there's not like question marks at the end of questions or things like that. And it's like, I think because her books are successful just because she writes them, I guess, in a way. You know, when you're a good big author, you write a book, people are gonna read it and people are gonna love it because they're part of the bandwagon. Yeah. You know, even though objectively it's probably not as good as like, for me, like her peak book is that the ones I read is like was Aqua War. Like that book was just so good and it slapped so hard, and so like trying to get back to that level for me is gonna be really hard with any other book I read from her. So yeah, I feel like I see what you're saying, and also like stories are very hard to force. You know, like you have a story and generally you have a beginning and an end when you're starting a story, because you're not gonna tell a story. You don't want to, in my opinion, I'm not a writer, but in my mind, I'm like, you don't want to set out to write a story that has no end, you know? Like for you, or for me at least, if I were to write a story, I'm like, this is my character, Farah Arsharan. She has 2 sisters, she has a dad, and she's going to go to this land to fulfill this thing, to meet this man, to become this person, end of story, you know? Like that's like, and then you kind of connect the dots on how to start from the beginning and end at the end. But like for me, it's like you can't force stories. And I understand that you can probably like develop, like what she did with Nessa with Silver Flames. Like, okay, this story ended, so I'm gonna pull another story because I want to develop these other characters, right? But I feel like you can't force that. And that's like part of the why creativity sometimes is so fickle. Like, so you can't force that. So like trying to force a deadline, trying to force like things have to happen by a certain time, I think is really difficult. And so like I'm interested to see how she's gonna do it, because I feel like not even J.K. Rowling had that. Like I think she just like had her story in her head. Yeah. And so in some moments, even when you've read all the Harry Potter books, you can kind of see how the Horcrux theory started to develop, and it wasn't necessarily there at the beginning. And so as you read, you're like, oh, she's developing this theory, and you're like, oh, I see how like her train of thought is coming. She knows that Harry's gonna defeat Voldemort, but she doesn't know how. And then you kind of see how that kind of comes together. But it ended, you know? And even her trying to bring it back up with Cursed Child was a flop. Because it ended. Nobody wants any, like, it's done. So you can't force it.
Totally. And I think that's like such an important part of creativity and of projects as well. Like, and then life in general, if you want to go even broader. And actually it was one of the topics that I was going to propose to you for another episode, which is like how to know when to stop. And I think that, you know, as important as it is to start, even in our episode that we did about the life mottos that help us to create and all of that, all of them are pretty much about like, you know, starting and keeping going, keep it going. I don't get it. Whatever. You know what I'm trying to say. Persevering. Because usually they're regarded as like the hardest parts, right? Like one, to get started, everyone says it's usually harder to get started, whatever. And then how to make your project, whatever, sustainable throughout time. But no one, or very few people know about like the importance of also knowing when to stop, when to shift gears, when to let go. And I remember listening to a podcast that was talking about this. And like one of the great examples, I think, amongst creatives of this is, Harry Potter's one that you just mentioned. And the other one was Seinfeld, the sitcom. You know, Seinfeld was such a success at the time when it ended that I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was this show where they like aired the finale at New York, like Times Square. At Times Square, and people gathered in the streets to watch because it's so popular. And the network and everyone kept asking Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David, like, dude, you're at your peak. Like, why don't you keep going? And they're like, no, it's time to stop. And I think that, it's done. And I think that not enough people kind of realize that knowing when to stop and let go is a big part of the creative process. And so with a lot of these critically acclaimed and commercially acclaimed projects, sometimes I think that there might be that temptation of just trying to keep it going and keep it going, keep it going for as long as possible. When sometimes, I'm not saying, like, definitely, I mean, Sarah J Maas won't even listen to this, but even if she did, like, I'm definitely not out here trying to say, like, oh, you should, stop a series or anything.
I'll still read the books.
Yeah, of course, I'll still read it, but I'm just like, there is an art, I think, and it's perhaps more towards, like, the publishing industry at large, to knowing, like, how to also take care of your authors and not just trying to continue milking the story, as you're saying, just because they're becoming commercially successful. Because to be honest, if a series is good and it's well done until the end, the success will continue the way it did with Harry Potter.
Yeah,
exactly. So I'm like, you'll still find ways, like, if we're talking purely money and profit, you'll find a way to keep milking it even past it's like once it's done. But if you keep it going and stretching it until, like, its bitter end, honestly, you might even lose some people. Yeah. Because truth be told, she was kind of losing me a little bit at the end of House of Flame and Shadow, like the Third Crescent City.
Yeah.
So, obviously you'll have your hard die people who will, like, never go no matter what.
Die hard.
Yeah. What?
Die hard, no? Hard die.
Oh. Yes. Die hard. Those people. I didn't even register that. I said it wrong. Yes, the die hard people who will, like, read you no matter what. But there will be a lot more readers that you might just, like, lose along the way, right?
Totally. But, yeah. And it's interesting that's Bloomsbury doing this because Harry Potter was a Bloomsbury publication too. Like, it's interesting that they're doing this because they also publish, like, the probably most successful series to date, because people keep buying Harry Potter. Yeah. People keep listening to Stephen Fry or the other dude narrate Harry Potter, and they're all kind of owned by this one publishing house. So, like, in my mind, I'm like, you should know that you can't force more stories out of stories that are done, Yeah. Like, the story that she wanted to tell was Harry's years in school, and that's what she told. And now anything else past that is not the story. It's not her story to tell. There's this, like, little epilogue at the end that makes us all cry, and then that's it. You don't have to tell the story of their children. Yeah, this is Harry Potter. It's not, Severus Potter or whatever.
Yeah.
So, like,
horrible name.
Horrible name. Horrible. But yeah, I feel similarly with this. I mean, again, you've read all of them, so you probably have a little bit more experience with her. But I feel the same way, and it's like what you're saying. It's like taking care of the authors and letting the authors tell their stories, and not trying to, like, knowing when to stop. It's something else. Like, I was listening to, how Google does this podcast? It's like Talks at Google, and they had the Schitt's Creek cast. So Eugene Levy and Dan Levy, who are the writers, and then they had Catherine O'Hara, and the whole cast. And Schitt's Creek stopped like six seasons. And it was like a speak. Like, when it stopped, like, people were watching it. CBC had never had any show that successful in its life. Yes. And CBC was like, please don't stop. Like, come on. And they stopped. And they decided that's the story we're going to tell. We want to tell this story. This is how we're going to tell it. And the story's over. And you constantly have it where like, shows go on extra season. Like, with Superstore, it happened. Yes. Where they go on extra season and then it just gets...
For me, Superstore went for three more seasons than it should have.
It was too forced, especially the last seasons where they tried to get woke, when the whole premise of the show, and I'm nothing against wokeness, but the whole premise of the thing is, like, this unequal society, The reason why Superstore was successful at the beginning is because you feel the dread of working at a store because you're in that society that, you know what I mean? So, like, when you try to force inclusion, which is what I'm afraid is going to end up happening with these books, because you can't go for that long without, like, listening to the people. You know what I mean? Yeah. Listening to the people telling you to be more inclusive. So when you try to force it, even though it's not a story you want to tell, because you don't have context to tell that story as a person, then it just gets a little sketchy for me. You know what I mean?
And to me, it's not even about, like, forced inclusion or anything like that. It's just, like, purely the story, just knowing when to end. Like, as you were saying, if this is the story that you wanted to tell it. You know what I mean? Like, it is a book. Like, if you're not able to get any of the things that are like part of the checklist right now, then don't, and write a different book, and then probably those will be different stories. Like for example, Rebecca Yarros, I think and like, don't come at me, not the biggest fan of the Empyrean series. I didn't love it. I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it the way some people love it. But I just really liked how she developed different characters who came from very different backgrounds, very different, like, lifestyles and contexts and whatnot, because they were part of the, like, what is it? Is it the Empire?
The Navarre.
Yeah, but not the city. You know how she, like, there's some people who, like,
it's called Navarre.
Oh, okay, whatever. So yeah, they came from
apart from different parts of the country, and they're all like,
different
black people over there. There's some like
they're different part of the countries, and like some of them learned about runes, some of them learned all languages, some of them, and then some of them are from the coast and whatever, and that's just like very much real life. Like, some of us come from different countries, some of us has different accents, some of us are different, come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, whatever. Like, and but my point is, like, as you're saying, like, also, don't try to milk or cater to every single need, because it's just one story. You won't be able to fit every single potential character or archetype that there is in the whole world in a single story. There will be more series. And then you can write those stories afterward. You know what I mean?
And you don't have to. Like, you don't have to write those stories too.
No, like if you wanted to.
But that's the thing that, like, I've been, because again, I haven't read all the books, but I did some research, and a lot of people were complaining about the lack of diversity in Sarah J Maas's books, because people feel like her books lack characters of color with depth, or she just like kind of like puts them in as a forced inclusion just because she needs to you have like your checkbox, or they'll fall into stereotypes like J.K. Rowling with Cho Chang, like this is the most stereotypical Chinese name, you know what I mean? Like, and she didn't feel, okay, of course, this is a different time, so people were not as like woke or whatever, but she didn't feel the need to expand on these characters of color. She just kind of, this is my story, and this is the people that I know, this is the background that I have, and nobody's complaining. People complain about J.K. Rowling for other things, and we're not gonna get into that. But nobody's complaining about the characters per se. The characters are the characters, and that's what that's it. Ron is a redhead, Hermione is white, Harry is white. Nobody bats an eye. So in my mind, it's like people complain about these things because it's the world we live in. But like she doesn't have to tell that story. That's not her. It's not her duty. Like she can do a better job at being a little bit more inclusive, like Rebecca Yarros did, where she from the get go, the story was there's this beautiful, inclusive, like fruitful, prolific society and culture, and I want to bring all of these aspects of the culture into it. But like that's not the story that Sarah J Maas was telling with ACOTAR. And so, like, of course, you get like the Illyrians who are different than the the people in other courts and whatnot, and that comes through, but it's not the main plot of the story. So when you try to force those things, it feels a little hypocritical, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Which is what's happened to TV shows like Superstore, like Brooklyn Nine-Nine with the last season, where they try to like force talk about like police brutality. Of course, it's a police show, so you kind of have to touch on the topic, but it was so intense that like it makes it feel a little out of place. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that definitely there's a huge bee. I'm sorry, that just came into my house and it's making me so nervous. But yeah, I mean, I think there is something to be said about the audience being able to voice like some of these like criticisms, because like I will agree, like I was definitely a person who wasn't always comfortable with the way that Sarah J Maas depicted female and male characters, which when they're fae are called males and females, and like the way that they related and the whole the whole like mates thing and like all of that, it didn't sit fully well with me. And I think that it has been a very like voiced criticism towards her and her books. But I also think that I always just like in general, whenever I see things that I don't necessarily agree with or don't sit right with me, I also take it as an opportunity to reflect why, and to reflect like why the author would have made those choices as well. and also to think about like why it's hitting a nerve. Like, for example, and I've said this publicly before, like I often have a very real issue with like just liking female characters in books, especially in romantic books, in young adult romantic books, very specifically, because I've read a lot of adult fiction and I have no problem. But a young adult romance books, for whatever reason, like there was a moment where I couldn't stand Bella Swan.
Oh, no, but nobody stands Bella Swan. Like,
well,
just all of these books are like, come on, man.
Yeah, but then there was a moment where I couldn't stand Katniss Everdeen and the girl from Divergent. I can't remember her name. And just like with and with Sarah J Maas's books, with most female leads, I had the same thing. And you know what? Like I've also taken it as an opportunity to reflect. Like, one, why am I not liking it? What part of their personality and their character development, like maybe I'm projecting something onto it, you know what I mean? Or like, why can I connect with them? Or why do authors keep making the choice to create female characters that are often unnecessarily complex? Because like, and why do we keep as a society binging books and selecting books that create this very likable male characters, but we always have to find a reason to fight with the female lead? You know what I mean? Like, why can't we just have like a female lead that we're all just like, my girl, you know? Love this girl from beginning to end. But
there's always a sidekick. There's always a sidekick that is that person.
Yes.
You know, like in the Empyrean books, that's Rhiannon. Yeah. Rhiannon is that sidekick where you're like, my girl, you're the girl. But then like Violet is like, come on, girl. Like, you know? Yeah. Like, it's always that sidekick that I'm like, I ask authors, can you just flip them around?
Right. So in my head, I think I just also, instead of like so much demanding of the author that they change it, because ultimately it's their story, they're the authors. But I do take an opportunity to reflect, like, why does this like rub me off the wrong way, or you know, or but nevertheless, I do think that of course, like, people are free to express their opinion and say, you know, this aspect of the book I kind of don't like it. But yeah, it's a complicated one, I think, especially and just to wrap it up, like we touched on a lot of the reasons why she's beloved. But even in this like last few minutes that we're talking about it, I think there's definitely some very valid criticism made to some of her books, especially the way they treat mostly that, like romantic relationships, female-male relationships, perhaps some parenting stuff, I don't know. But some of the overuse of steam and smut in some of her books,
especially the last like Silverflake is so unnecessarily smutty, in my opinion.
Yes, in ways that are sometimes definitely unnecessary, like they don't add anything to the book. Personally, I think
I agree with you with that.
I think that definitely, like, there, as with anything, especially with the bigger it becomes, like the more criticism and backlash it will face. But I think that nevertheless, like, there is a big value in just in all of these books that are like really exploding mostly on like book talk and whatnot. There's just a great value in them just getting a new generation to read, right? And kind of into reading and reclaiming kind of that practice and the value of sitting down with a book and letting your imagination kind of run wild.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, and this was the same conclusion we reached when we talked about Colleen Hoover, because some of the criticisms are very similar, you know. The way they depict abuse and all these things in relationships in particular, like it's problematic, and of course we need to reflect. And I think that's kind of what I was trying to get to when I was trying to say that that's not the story she wants to tell. It's like, I'm not saying, what I'm trying to say is she doesn't have a duty to make the world right. So us as readers, in my opinion, we need to read and understand why this is rubbing us the wrong way, or why it's making us angry, or why, because it's the same things we see in the world, and reflecting and understanding will make us behave differently. Because she writes a story doesn't mean that she also does these things. It's just a story she's trying to tell as a person, you know, and as an author, separating the art from the artist and the book from the author. So because we as humans we tend to be really bad at that. Yes. But also, like, like what you were saying, I lost my train of thought. Oh, yeah, that the impact that this is having in people reading is huge. And in people writing new books and in people like readers being inspired, people that have wanted to write forever, being inspired to start writing and publish books themselves, like Sarah J Maas did. And like maybe one day they can become huge, maybe they don't, but they get to tell their story and find a place for their voice to be heard, for people to have community with each other, for people to feel like they belong to this wider community of people, and to see that we have lots of things in common. So I think even though her books have points that are not as strong, perhaps, they are also great at getting people to read, and I think that's a win, because you can't start reading by like reading a very like highbrow 100 Years of Solitude book that like won't get you into it. These books get people's appetite wet, and then maybe they stay just reading these kind of books, and that's great, because then they get to read and like put their phones down, or maybe they start getting more into literature and start reading books that are like genre defining or whatnot, you know. So I think that's a huge impact.
Totally. And you know what, like when Rosalia, just my closing thought, now that you said that, like how it's prompted other people maybe to write and whatnot, I feel really identified with that. Like the first novel I tried to write was when I was 12, and it was a fantasy novel. And I remember like I had just put that dream to bed years ago, like not the writing part, but the fantasy writing part. And honestly, like after reading ACOTAR, my wheels were just turning. I feel like there was a part of my brain that had been dormant for years, and it just, you know, the light bulb went on as I was reading. And I remember when Rosalia released her album Motomami, she did a TikTok live, and she was inviting different artists to just like chat and give their impressions of the book. And Camilo, a very one of the most creative artists, I think, in our generation in the Latin world at the moment. He told her, like, when I heard your album, it prompted me to want to create, and I went to the studio. Like after listening to Motomami, he went to the studio because the album, and Rosalia told him, like, that is the biggest compliment you can give an artist and give a creator, like saying like, your work inspired me to create, you know, your creation had that impact. And I think that, and right now when you were saying this, like it reminded me of that. I think that if we get a generation and just like a bunch of readers, a group of readers, thousands of people in the world, like not only back to reading, which is already great in and of itself. Of course, I'm biased because I love it, but I think it's good. If we get a bunch of people just inspired to create after reading them, that's like huge, even extra bonus, right? Like, as we were saying, like whether it be fan art or fanfics or your own novels or, you know, podcast, music, workout routines, whatever it is that this book prompts out of you that like really gets you going in whatever your area is, I think then
huge win.
Yeah, that's already a huge win. No matter like the criticisms, right? There's always room for improvement for everyone on earth. But you're already doing more than what a lot of people are. Yeah. So
yes.
Yeah. So with that, I think, if you're interested in it, if this podcast has like prompted you in any sort of way, I would say go for it. And my personal recommendation would be to start with the ACOTAR series, even though Sarah J Maas herself said she recommends starting with Throne of Glass. But I disagree.
Yeah.
With all due respect to the author.
With all due respect, Mrs. Author. And another thing we wanted to say, just reminding you that to subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening, to leave a review if you can, and to follow us on Instagram, because we generally post clips of the podcast that you can share with others, and also we post like things we're working on creatively, or we post recommendations or you know, original content and whatnot. So it's a cool place to be, and we're trying to grow this community of creatives. So if this inspires you, you can see our content over there as well.
Yep, and we'll see each other next week. Bye.
Bye.